Greetings from the Asian Institute of Technology. Can everybody hear me? Am I audible? Please type in the chat
Yes,
box.
you are.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, you are. Good day.
Welcome to DRSD's Technical Session 6, Vulnerability, Resilience, and Sustainable Development 2. My name is Luis Arboleda, and I am the Zoom host for this hall. The rapporteur for this session is Ms. Hen Kam. A few reminders before we proceed and turn over to our co-chairs. The Zoom session is being recorded. The recording will be made available upon request. If you have any objections, kindly inform us in advance. There will be a total of 10 presentations in this session. A technical session chair will be announcing each presentation and respective presenter. The discussion and Q&A portion will be held when all 10 presentations have ended. The audience can take advantage of the chat box to ask their questions and queries to the presenters. We would like to request the presenters to keep tabs on the chat box and answer any questions directed to them. If not, we may address these questions at the end of the session or in the Padlet. Now, before we proceed to the presentations, it is my honor to introduce to you the technical session chairs. Our first technical session chair is Dr. Joyi S. Chatterjee. She is an assistant professor in the Gender and Development Studies Department at AIT School of Environment Resources and Development. She is a communication and gender expert specialized in studying social and behavior change, health and social disparities, and role of media technologies in cultural change. Dr. Chatterjee has a PhD and MA in communication from University of Southern California and an MA in social work from Tata Institute of Social Sciences and a BA in political science from Delhi University. Our next technical session chair is Mr. Michael Boylan. He is a research fellow in climate change, disasters, and development at the Stockholm Environment Institute, SEI, Asia office, located in Bangkok, Thailand. He leads several research projects and coordinates the International Center of Excellence on Transforming Development and Disaster Risk, supported by the Integrated Research on Disaster Risk Program and hosted by SEI. Welcome to both technical co-chairs. I hand over the mic to you and we can continue with this session. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, moderator, and good evening, everybody from Bangkok. It's great to see you all. Thank you to my fellow co-chair, Professor Joyi, as well. I think we would like to get straight into the presentations. We're all here to listen and learn from the wonderful speakers we have. So without further ado, if co-chair Joyi doesn't mind, we'll go straight into the first presentation from Shweta Sinha on climate change impacts in India, cross-sectoral case studies.
Considering the unique geography coupled with the climatic diversity in India makes it vulnerable to a range of climate-induced natural disasters. It has also been ranked 7th according to the Global Climate Risk Index, with maximum fatalities amongst the top 10 risky countries, and also with maximum absolute losses among these countries. Now, this global warming is also seen having different kind of repercussions in terms of heat wave, floods, droughts, water stress, sea level rise, and much more. And particularly 2019 was one of the most active Northern Indian Ocean cyclone season on records, which had a total of 8 tropical cyclones, out of which 6 became very severe, with Fani one of the worst of them. And overall concerns regarding the disruptions due to COVID is again raising a lot of issues in terms of increased environmental degradation. Talking about the Sdg Status of India, one of the recent report in this week, launched this week, talks about the achievement of climate action SDG 13. And this is with respect to the carbon emissions. There are various other initiatives which have been taken by India in terms of improving the other SDGs, but water remains a critical challenge, and COVID-19 is further adding uncertainties. Specifically when we see water impacting all the SDGs strongly or somehow related or indirectly related to water-related issues. There are different kind of key environmental challenges India is facing these days, and the nationally determined contributions, about 8 of them, the 6th one clearly talks about adaptability and mitigation of climate change issues. So we'll be particularly focusing on just 3 of them here. So the whole presentation highlights 5 major issues, starting with the first one as the heat waves. As you can see, the current situation in India, the heat wave caused more than 6,000 deaths in India, 2015 being the deadliest, but it has further been reduced to 4 deaths in 2020 because of certain actions by the government. Now, these actions, although March 2021 was the hottest month in the last decade, but certain actions have helped in terms of accurate weather warning, better health systems to manage the affected people, and also focusing on the behavioral change and building awareness. But a lot more has to be done in terms of mitigation strategies, which are needed towards reducing the urban heat island effect and reducing indoor temperatures through the heat action plans and better urban planning. The second highlight is issues related to rising temperature. We will not talk about the impact, but directly look at some of the solutions in terms of agriculture. About 11.4 million hectares have undergone micro irrigation by 2019, and the average productivity of fruits and vegetables has also increased by 11%. Apart from this, there are various water smart practices, nutrient smart practices, weather smart activities, carbon smart activities, and knowledge smart activities, which are already in action at different levels. Similarly, talking about the water resources, one of the excellent example is the Sonbhadra district, which has replicated some rainwater harvesting and water conservation cases replicated from Rajasthan. And of course, there are various rice intensification, wastewater, and the government is focusing more on the water positive investments in different parts of the country. The third highlight is talking about the coastal sea level rise, where we can see amongst 135 coastal cities across the world, Mumbai ranks second as the most risky city due to climate and also the sea level rise coupled with the extreme weather events. Now, the decadal increase in cyclone events has increased 6 times from 2 cyclones in 1979 to 12 during 2019. And it has seen more impacts on the Maharashtra coastal regions. And there are different studies which talk about sea level rise in the Arabian Sea as well as the Bay of Bengal. And we could see various restoring mangroves, wetland, and other issues which have provided support in terms of climate proofing and also generating green economic opportunities in Maharashtra province as well as other parts of the country. Also, the government of West Bengal has taken some initiatives, but it still seems insufficient in the current scenario. So there is much more to be done in terms of the adaptation in pathways needed for the sea level rise in India. Talking about the nature-based solutions, there are various examples throughout the country, but there is need to upscale and create enabling environment to build knowledge, to expand from the pilot projects. So we also see the nature-based solution in adaptation. It's an adaptation component in the NDC, and there are about less than 30 nature-based projects in India, which has more focus on intense precipitation, droughts, and coastal issues. So recently, the IUCN launched the global standard of nature-based solutions to increase the scale, access, effectiveness of interventions, and also the Urban Nature Index through this Urban Alliance. There is more work to be done in terms of cost benefit of nature-based solutions and need for integrated policy and evidence-based measuring the effectiveness of nature-based solutions, there are quite a few cases. If we also look at some of the database like the Oxford database for nature-based solutions and so on and so forth. The last and the fifth highlight, which is talking about the environmental impact assessments in India. Throughout the process which exists here, we can see it's quite lots of changes happening in this area. The recent EIA draft notification 2020 talks about the post-facto approval, where the environmental clearance will be granted even after the construction has started in order to stop hindering the economic development. There are certain changes to the public consultation process, which has been reduced from 30 days to 20 days. Again, the compliance report can be submitted once a year instead of 6 months. And now it's also, according to this notification, it is possible to bypass the EIA in terms of it's not needed if the project is considered strategic by the government. There are multiple number of cases we could talk about it, but the highlight is that we need to strike a balance between environment protection and economic development, especially for developing economies. And I think I will stop here with this, with some quick conclusion comments where we can see the increasing vulnerability of cities, which is adding further stress to the adaptive capacities of the poor. We need more localized data systems on water resources. There's very limited coverage and coordination in this area. Apart from managing the water resources, it's also interesting to promote sustainable consumption and production in India, because we can clearly see 40% of the food produced is wasted, losing huge amount of water, fertilizers, and other resources. And there is need for integrated policy and evidence-based measuring the effectiveness of nature-based solutions. The recent adaptation gap report indicates there are about 34% of nature-based solutions in the areas of river and forest, about 21% in the agricultural areas, but only 6 to 4% in terms of mangroves and coastal wetlands, respectively. So there are more interventions with the interdisciplinary approach needed, coupled with the climate resilience technology to mitigate climate risk at regional and local levels in India. And EIA plays a crucial role in better decision-making for our future environment. So I will pause here and thank you all and the organizers for this opportunity, and I'm available for any further discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sweater, and it's good to see you in the room as well. And we'll hopefully get some questions towards the end of the session. Next, we will hear from Karen Joyce Kayamanda, hope I've pronounced that correctly, who will present, or we will see a video looking towards an inclusive communication management framework for flood risk reduction in Davao City, Southern Philippines. Hopefully, if the moderator is ready with the next video, we will move to the next presentation. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. This is Professor Karen Joyce G. Kayamanda, an associate professor from the University of the Philippines, Mindanao, here in Davao City, Philippines. The paper I'm going to share with you today is part of my dissertation under the PhD Development Studies program, which focuses on the risk reduction of flooding among vulnerable communities in Davao City, Southern Philippines. It highlights on the risk communication management framework towards an inclusive and community-based approach. The Philippines' exposure to tropical storms and climate-related hazards makes it highly vulnerable to disasters. The Mindanao region has experienced a few tropical storms and typhoons in the past. However, the magnitude of impact of Tropical Storm Washi or Sendong in 2011 and Typhoon Bofa or Pablo in 2012 has resulted to loss of lives and livelihood. Davao City in particular, being one of the largest cities in the world, is comprised of 182 barangays or communities in its 244,000 hectares land area. Its location may be considered a typhoon-free zone in the past, but it is not the same today. Its geographic location, combined with urbanization, makes it vulnerable to flooding and landslides. Unfortunately, 63 or 35% from the 182 barangays are considered highly vulnerable to flooding and landslides. Since extensive literature on disaster studies highlight technical and scientific approaches, this paper focuses on the need of the communities to build and enhance resilience to disasters like flooding and mitigate its impact to minimize the cost and damage through an inclusive and participatory approach towards a sustainable community-based adaptive capacities. It is a reality that disasters induced by climate change will be more frequent and ferocious in the future, hence requires a steadfast resolution. This study utilized a system-based approach capturing the interrelationship of all the elements involved in disaster management, response and mitigation, highlighting the role of the communities as central actor in the process. Specifically, this study aims to establish the role of risk communication system at the community level, to help develop community-based risk communication management focusing on participatory and localized approach, and third, to recommend a possible policy alternative to institutionalize a localized or community-based risk communication system for the flood-vulnerable communities of Davao City. This study used a convergent parallel mixed method, integrating the qualitative and quantitative data collection techniques such as document reviews, network analysis, key informant interviews, focus group discussions, and the survey. The survey employed a multi-stage sampling using the 5 most vulnerable communities and subjected this to proportional allocation to determine the representative sample population for the study. The merging of both results in the analysis and interpretation helped identify the convergence or divergence of the findings, leading to the development of the framework, which is community-based, to address risk reduction at the community levels of Davao City. This paper, however, puts emphasis on 2 major results from among the list that support the need for building community resilience that is anchored on a localized and participatory approach towards an inclusive risk reduction. A more effective and efficient disaster risk reduction and management can be attained by looking into the significant role of the community's perception of risks, vulnerabilities, attitudes and responses to flooding, as well as the adaptive practices that they have developed through the years. A community-based approach to risk reduction can address the challenge for policymakers and disaster managers to achieve effective and responsive disaster management using the most appropriate channels and tools in communicating risk messages through a well-defined risk communication management framework. The figure shows the community-based flood risk communication management framework, addressing the gaps identified in the results of the study and highlights the following major key areas. First, a strong community participatory focus. Second, community empowerment to build adaptive strategies toward resilience. Third, encourages context-specific and collective mitigation response. And fourth, enhanced multilateral knowledge development approach for a more integrative, inclusive, and dynamic disaster risk reduction. The study highlighted the role of risk communication management approach, which was found to be the gap in the extensive literature and studies examined. Results have provided alternative approaches in addressing risk reduction and management. The specific recommendations include contribution in the areas of governance, policy implications, and practical suggestions to improve the transactional and dynamic process of communicating risk messages for community resilience. The major areas to consider in line with the institutionalization of a localized disaster risk reduction communication intervention include consolidate the existing policies, regulations, and update governance-related documents to address the dynamic needs of the community level towards community resilience. Second, risk communication and management studies should be further explored at the community levels to document experiences, analyze risk perception and awareness, and highlight best practices as baseline data for context-specific disaster risk and reduction management strategies. And risk perception studies can provide or should provide localized context to build resilience and further enhance adaptive capacities at the community levels of Davao City. In conclusion, results of this study have shown that building and strengthening community resilience is a process involving interrelated disaster risk reduction elements and strategies, including efficient risk communication management, a duality in approach capitalizing on community-based disaster risk and reduction management interventions, and strong community resilience can provide inclusive disaster resilience towards sustainable development at the community levels, specifically in this case, Davao City, Southern Philippines. Again, this is Professor Karen Joyce G. Kayamanda from the University of the Philippines, Mindanao, Davao City, Philippines. Thank you for listening. Good day, everyone, and stay safe.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kayamanda, for that great presentation, bringing in risk communication and perception in localizing disaster risk reduction. Thank you. Next, I'm happy to welcome Dr. Shubham Pathak, who will bring us back to Thailand to discuss oil spill laws, a legal perspective, oil spill disasters in Thailand, an issue which I feel is not normally in the mainstream of disaster risk reduction, both from a legal perspective and also looking at oil spill hazards. So I'm very interested to hear the next presentation. Thank you.
Good morning, myself Dr. Shubham Pathak. Along with my co-author, Mr. Sivarut Laikram, I would like to present our research on oil spill laws, a legal perspective for oil spill disasters in Thailand. We both are lecturers at Boylan University in Nakhon Si Thammarat, Thailand. We would be discussing the background, introduction, literature review, methodology, and the findings from this paper. And then we will talk about the discussion and recommendations. In terms of the background, Thailand have a long and productive coastal belt along with its southern provinces. It provides for the economic growth for the exclusive economic zone through its port and harbors. In terms of oil spill disaster response and recovery process, Thailand has a defined framework. However, it is dependent on the reporting of the oil spill incident by a witness. Once it's reported, Committee on the Prevention and Combating of Oil Pollution, they approve and set up the operational unit to deal with the oil spill. In terms of the literature review, there is a lack of literature in terms of the oil spill legal framework in Thailand. Thailand has been following international convention, and they founded two specific laws in which they deal with the oil pollution damage caused by the ships in 2017. However, both of these acts are not perfectly implemented at the local level. These acts also provide the defined ship owners who are liable parties to pay the damages in case of an oil spill event. These are some previous oil spill events in Thailand. In terms of methodology, this is a qualitative methodology research in which we try to find the input from the secondary data and key informant interviews, which were done with the selected respondents from concerned ministries, departments, and stakeholders. Analysis of this data is done through SWOT. In terms of the response of the oil spill in Thailand, there is three-tier system. In tier 1, where the oil spill is less than 20 tons, which is caused mostly while transferring the oil at the port or the harbor. In tier 2, the oil spill is between the range of 20 tons to 1,000 tons. In these cases, local and national level government is incorporated for the response efforts. In case the situation is beyond their control, international assistance may be requested by Thailand. In terms of more than 1,000 tons oil spill, it is under the tier 3 system, in which Thailand requests for the international assistance for the cleanup and response mechanism. In terms of the legal system, it is on 3 levels. First one is the local level, where the Department of Fisheries takes care of the small and medium oil spill disasters. In terms of the medium and large scale, national level follows the Oil Pollution Act under the Marine Department. In terms of the large oil spill disasters, international level, UNCLOS and the International Tanker Owners Pollution Federation steps in to assist the Thailand. In terms of the SWOT, the strength are existing framework, ample number of volunteers, and ever-growing economy of Thailand. However, there are some weaknesses, which are absence of the prompt decision-making, over-dependence on the evidence and reporting by the witness, and a strict top-to-bottom approach where the local level government do not have the capacities to deal with the oil spill at their own level. In terms of the opportunities, Thailand could exploit the growing economy and its position in the ASEAN countries. They can enhance the environmental tourism along with integrating all the stakeholders. In terms of the threat, nowadays, currently, the recurring COVID-19 threat is there. And the basic issue was found to be the obsolete government policies and over-dependence on the international assistance and aid. Therefore, for the recommendations, there must be restructuring of the standard operating protocol, SOPs, to curtail the damages from the oil spill disasters. The local level government agencies must be empowered to respond towards the oil spill disasters. The government must create monetary fund to be self-sufficient and provide prompt financial assistance. The government must ensure the safety procedures of the small boats who are not equipped with non-structural measures such as insurance. Government must ensure development of tourism in order to support the small boat owners. In the end, we would like to conclude that in the times of COVID-19, mega floods, and long-lasting droughts in Thailand, the Thailand government must also take heed in terms of the oil spill disasters. The legal framework is existing. However, the implementation must be revisited and revised adequately. These acts are to be revised, including the Navigation in the Thai Waters Act, Civil and Commercial Law Code of Thailand, and International Fund of Compensation for Oil Pollution Damage Caused by the Ships Act. These are some references. These are some photographs taken from Thailand oil spill disasters at Koh Samet. The birds, the fish, the flora and fauna is adversely impacted in short and long-term both, but together we can survive with the disasters better. These are our emails if you want any further questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very interesting presentation from Thailand. Next, we'll be going back to the Philippines, and we will hear from Sarah Healy and colleagues on understanding and mapping the spatial variability of social vulnerability in the Philippines. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sophie, and also presenting today are Jasmine and Sarah. We are currently completing our engineering honours thesis as part of the Humanitarian Frontiers Lab at the University of Sydney, under the supervision of Aaron Opdike. Our research seeks to answer the question, how does social vulnerability vary at the municipal level across the Philippines? The goal of the research is to assist in allocation of resources and disaster mitigation efforts to those communities most in need of disaster risk reduction. In order to address this question, we began by reviewing literature to identify key indicators of social vulnerability. We then sourced information pertaining to these indicators from national census data and developed a social vulnerability index to investigate how the chosen indicators contribute to social vulnerability. Spatial analysis software was then used to map the indicators and the developed index at a municipality level across the Philippines in order to visually document the variability in social vulnerability. The Philippines is highly exposed to natural hazards, which when combined with a combination of political, social and economic factors, renders the country as one of the world's most at risk to disasters. Between 2000 and 2016, natural disasters in the Philippines caused over 23,000 deaths and affected roughly 125 million people. The Philippines comprises three main regions running north to south, with each region experiencing variable disaster risk. In the context of typhoons, for example, even though a greater number and generally more severe typhoons hit the north of the Philippines, research has uncovered that there are provinces in the south with comparatively high numbers of fatalities, suggesting contributing factors beyond exposure and intensity. Historically, disaster management and risk reduction policy has focused on the physical aspects of vulnerability. However, the uneven distribution of disaster damages and losses across the Philippines cannot be explained by the physical environment alone. In the mid-1970s, a new definition of vulnerability emerged, being a culmination of physical, political, social and economic factors, each of which vary immensely spatially, meaning that disaster risk is also highly variable. Populations that lack access to economic and social resources, independence and power, as well as those who live in low-quality housing, are expected to be particularly vulnerable to disasters. Research to measure social vulnerability has been conducted globally. For example, Cutter et al. Was the first to develop an index to measure social vulnerability in the United States. This method has since been adapted and applied in a broad range of contexts, inspiring the study of other similar yet context-specific indicators of social vulnerability. There have been multiple attempts to map social vulnerability in the Philippines on a national, regional, and provincial level. However, understanding of this vulnerability at lower administrative levels is limited on a national scale, resulting in potentially missing explanations of how localized conditions enhance disaster risk. This study seeks to construct a social vulnerability index at a municipal level across the entire Philippines in order to demonstrate the spatial variability that occurs at lower administrative levels, hence contributing more significantly to targeted disaster risk reduction interventions.
In order to conduct a municipal level spatial analysis study on social vulnerability across the Philippines, we developed a social vulnerability index that used the tabulated indicators as proxies for social vulnerability. The relationship to vulnerability can be seen in the second column of the table, showing whether the chosen indicator is thought to increase or decrease social vulnerability. The social vulnerability index was generated for each municipality by normalizing each indicator to a value between 0 and 1 and using an equally weighted method to combine the normalized values. Data relating to each indicator was sourced from the 2015 census data made publicly available by the Philippine Statistics Authority. The data was then extracted and assigned to a consistent municipal code so that it could be joined with a database of known administrative boundaries, given the geographic signature to the data and allowing it to be mapped. The featured maps show the spatial variability of each chosen indicator, mapped at a municipal level across the Philippines. Housing, wall and roof material, access to electricity for lighting, poverty incidence, and home ownership show clear variation between northern and southern municipalities. Percentages of home ownership, houses with concrete wall material, and homes using electricity for lighting are generally concentrated to northern municipalities, whereas high poverty incidence and homes with non-engineered roofs are concentrated in the south. The distribution of population density and average household size do not show as clear trends and therefore can be assumed to be less meaningful in their overall contribution to the vulnerability index. As part of our research, we have also mapped the developed social vulnerability index as a metric for showing how overall social vulnerability varies at a municipal level across the Philippines. Since concrete housing material and home ownership were assumed to have a negative relationship with vulnerability, their comparative lack of occurrence in southern municipalities contributes to a higher degree of vulnerability in the south. Similarly, the positive relationship between non-engineered roof material and poverty incidence and vulnerability, and the dominant occurrence of these indicators in the south, also highlights that municipalities in the southern Philippines are perhaps more vulnerable. A range of 64.18 in vulnerability indices highlights the extreme variability of vulnerability across the Philippines. The map clearly shows the aforementioned increase in social vulnerability in southern municipalities, as well as coastal municipalities to the east and west of the country.
Several limitations exist in our research and provide avenues for potential improvements in future work. Firstly, the choice of vulnerability indicators was limited by a lack of baseline census data available at the municipal level. We plan to request more datasets from the Philippine Statistics Authority to make our choice of indicators more robust. Secondly, the use of an equally weighted method to combine the normalized values of each indicator fails to account for the varying levels of importance amongst indicators. For example, studies have shown that poverty is one of the most important indicators of vulnerability, yet our index does not account for this. Moreover, the assumed relationship between the indicators and vulnerability may be an oversimplification. For instance, poorly constructed concrete homes may be more vulnerable to damage than well-constructed wooden homes, yet we have assumed that all concrete homes are less vulnerable to damage. Finally, 2015 census data was used as a proxy for the entire 10-year study period. Since vulnerability is a dynamic metric, using only 2015 data may not accurately represent the municipality's variability in vulnerability over time. To conclude, the generated social vulnerability index shows high variability in social vulnerability across the Philippines, with southern municipalities and coastal municipalities in the east and west of the country being the most vulnerable. In terms of future research, we aim to validate our social vulnerability index through linear regression analysis with actual observed damages and losses. In order to do this, we will create ordinary least squares algorithms and geographically weighted regression models to quantify the relationship between vulnerability and mortality. Further research will also focus on typhoon-specific vulnerability in the Philippines, allowing for more targeted disaster risk reduction planning, and there is also potential to alter this index to be specific to other hazards. We also hope to use an analytic hierarchy process to consider the level of importance of each indicator and draw data from the 2005, 2010, and 2015 census to derive a more accurate temporal cross-section of results. Thank you very much for your time, and we welcome any questions.
Thank you very much, Sarah, Sophie, and Jasmine, for that great presentation. For those that have joined us since we started, welcome to technical session number 6 on vulnerability, resilience, and sustainable development. For our 5th presentation, we'll be staying in the Philippines, and we will hear from Darlene Tandang, who will take us to Laguna and specifically talk about assessing household vulnerability to flooding using a livelihood vulnerability index in selected paroques of Los Baños, Laguna. After the 5th presentation, I will be happy to hand over to my co-chair, Professor Joy, for the introducing of the final 5 presentations. Thank you.
Good day, everyone. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Indrajit Pal, the conference chair and organizing committee of the Asian Institute of Technology for organizing this event. It is a privilege to be one of the presenters in this international conference. I am Darlene Aitanda from the University of the Philippines, Los Baños. I will be presenting the study entitled Assessing Household Vulnerability to Flooding using Livelihood Vulnerability Index in selected puroks of Los Baños, Laguna. The outline of the presentation includes introduction, methods, results and discussions, conclusion, and recommendations. For the introduction, the municipality of Los Baños, Laguna in the Philippines had experienced destructive flash floods of up to 2 meters in depth due to frequent typhoons hitting the country. These events have caused the loss of property, livelihood, and human life. Based on the Local Climate Change Action Plan of Los Baños, 12 out of 14 barangays are in the flood-prone areas and about 1,560 people are exposed to flood. This study assessed the vulnerability of households to flooding in selected puroks of Los Baños, Laguna using the Livelihood Vulnerability Index or LVI. Specifically, the study aimed to determine the livelihood vulnerability of households based on the capital assets such as human, natural, financial, physical, and social, identify challenges and strategies of the local government units or LGUs related to flood or disaster management, and recommend strategies for the improvement of household resilience or adaptive capacity to flooding. For the significance of the study, the households affected by flooding are in nearby water bodies and flood-prone areas. Many of these households are far past the option for relocation. Thus, there is a pressing need to measure and address the vulnerability of these households. For the methods, areas with very high flood susceptibility rating were chosen. These are Purok 3 in Barangay Bayog, Purok 6 in Barangay Mayingdon, Purok 3 or Upper Dampalit in Barangay Lalakay. The data were analyzed through household surveys and key informant interviews. Only 30 households in each of puroks were surveyed, and representatives from the barangays, Municipal Disaster Reduction Management Office, Climate Change Office, and Municipal Planning and Development Office were interviewed. To improve understanding of people's livelihoods and vulnerability, LBI analysis was used in the study. It comprised of 12 major components which are health, knowledge and skills, livelihood strategies, land, water, natural resources, natural disasters, social demographic profile, social networks, housing and production means, finances and incomes, and food. For the LVI, because each of the subcomponents is measured on a different scale, it was first necessary to standardize each subcomponent as an index. In this equation, S sub B is the regional subcomponent for Purok, and S sub min and S sub max are the minimum and maximum values, respectively, for each of Puroks. After each was standardized, the subcomponents were averaged using the equation on the screen to calculate the value of each major component. Once values for each of the 12 major components for Purok were calculated, they were averaged using the equation on the screen. Kindly take note that in the study, the LVI is scaled from 0, the least vulnerable, to 1, the most vulnerable. In Figure 1, the vulnerability diagram shows the major components of Purok 3 in Barangay Bayog, Purok 6 in Barangay Mayingdon, and Purok 3 or Upper Dampalit in Barangay Lalakay. Purok 3, Barangay Bayog, had the greatest food index, was caused by higher proportion of households who did not have enough food, had the highest finance incomes index due to greater percentage of households borrowing money during flood, had the highest housing and production means index due to higher percentage of households with house affected by flood partially to totally submerged, had the highest natural resources index due to its house location along the Laguna Lake had the highest livelihood strategies index due to higher percentage of households with family members exploiting natural resources and had the highest health index due to higher percentage of households with family members have immediate health effects during the flood. Purok 6, Barangay Maindon, had the highest index of social networks and natural disasters due to its higher percentage of households who did not receive assistance last flood event and had the highest socio-demographic profile due to its higher percentage of female head households. Purok 3 or Upper Dampalit, Barangay Lalakay, had the highest index mainly due to higher percentage of households that primary source of water contaminated after flood and had the highest land index due to higher percentage of landless households. In figure 2, Purok 3 Barangay Bayog had the highest LVI 0.418 based on the capital assets, while Purok 3 or Upper Dampalit, Barangay Lalakay had the lowest 0.324. The challenges of the LGUs are location, and housing materials. The current strategies of the LGUs to reduce vulnerabilities are location, disaster management training, and early warnings. LVI recognized that among the three sites, Purok 3, Barangay Bayog is the most vulnerable to flooding based on the 5 capital assets compared to other study sites. Purok 6, Barangay Maindon, and Purok 3 or Upper Dampalit, Barangay Lalakay. Strategies to improve household resilience or adaptive capacity should include diversification of income sources, promotion of health awareness, encourage community involvement, and strengthen government support towards adaptation and mitigation of the impacts of flooding. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks a lot, and thanks to Michael for taking us ably through the first half. We're now going to move back to India, and we have Sarvapriya, who's going to be talking about wind hazards on Indian power system and challenges for the future review.
My name is Sarvapriya and I am a research scholar at Delhi Technological University, Delhi, India. Today I am going to present my review paper on wind hazards on the Indian power systems and challenges for future, a review in DRSD 2021. As we know, the natural hazard is a natural phenomena that might have negative impact on the geophysical and biological system. Cyclones, earthquakes, floods, and landslide are the natural hazards which have been occurring in various parts of the world every year. Power system consists of generation, distribution, and transmission subsystems that play a vital role in social and economic development. Major damages occur in the power systems due to the extreme weather conditions like cyclones. Therefore, to estimate the damage in the power system, vulnerability models are developed. Vulnerability means the inability to withstand the effect of an adverse environment. Vulnerabilities are classified as physical, social, economic, territorial, organizational, environmental, and systematic. Physical and systematic vulnerabilities are more popular among all the vulnerabilities to analyze the damage that might be occurred due to the cyclonic hazards. Physical vulnerability tells about the measurement of damage due to the external load. Systematic vulnerabilities tells about the resilience of a component in a network or collapse of interconnected networks. The Indian subcontinent is one of the most sensitive cyclone-prone regions in the world. India consists of almost 7,500 kilometers of coastline, and around 10% of the world's tropical cyclones influence this coastline. If we look at the map of India, the eastern coastline is more vulnerable than the western coastline. In this slide, we have summarized the various cyclones with their sustained wind speed category and impact on Indian power system. These are the some photographs of partially and completely damaged transmission towers in Kolkata city by Amphan cyclone 2020. First two figures shows the partially damaged transmission tower and rest of the three pictures shows the completely damaged transmission towers. Now the advantages and disadvantages of analytical methods and simulation method. In the literature survey, it is found that the probabilistic approach is widely used for prediction of damage due to the various events, and probabilistic approach is classified into analytical method and simulation method. The analytical method includes the probability convolution method, series and parallel network, Bayesian network method, and Markov method. And simulation method includes the state enumeration method and Monte Carlo method. Probability convolution method can be used to evaluate the hazards by differencing the two random variables, and it has less variables and easy to determine the hazards. The disadvantage of this method is that we cannot assess the hazard for multivariables and complex power systems. The advantage of series and parallel network method is that the hazards can be easily determined because of less variables, and this method is good for computer programming. Disadvantage of this method is that it cannot be used to complex power system. Bayesian network method provides a mathematically logical structure for study and useful to model uncertain and complex situations. And the disadvantage is that this is a visual probabilistic model that depends on various variables conditionally, and to get the effective outcome, probabilities of all the random variables need to be simplified. Markov method is a powerful tool for prediction of events, but it is not able to provide the explanation of the events. Now the simulation method. As I told earlier, the simulation method includes the state enumeration method and Monte Carlo method. The advantage of the state enumeration method is that it is an accurate and efficient and useful to assess the weak point of the system, and disadvantage of this method is that it does not consider the high order failure. Monte Carlo method increases the computing power, and it is useful in non-linear and dynamic models, but it is not, it is more expensive and time taking. Now the challenges and future research direction. Based on the literature review and observations, we can identify the following emerging points that necessitate further research work. The first point is several failure models have been developed to evaluate the wind hazards on power system, but still more research is required to develop a comprehensive failure models, and it can be achieved by synthesizing the pattern-based simulation approaches with more exact vulnerability curves. Second point is the interrelationship between interdependent power subsystems needs to be broadly analyzed so that we can assess the effect of failure of each subsystem component on the other linked subsystems. Third point is more research is needed to describe the effect of climate change on physical infrastructure and operational conditions of the power systems. Fourth point, most of the vulnerabilities models are developed internationally. Therefore, a model needs to be developed considering the Indian subcontinent conditions. Now the conclusion. Under the extreme weather condition like cyclone causes considerable damages on the power system. In the literature review, it is found that the distribution subsystem is more vulnerable than generation and transmission subsystems under the cyclonic hazard. Physical and systematic vulnerabilities approaches are used to predict the damages on components within the subsystems and interconnected subsystems respectively, which is an essential step in the direction of resilience modeling. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you, Dr. Sarvapriya. I can see that we have quite a lively chat going. So please, I'll encourage everybody, if you have questions for the speaker, to please put it in the chat box. We hope to have some time towards the end to have a sort of more live Q&A discussion, but just in case we are running short of time, it's good if you engage directly in the chat box. All of our speakers are also present here. Next, we have Gitanjali Kumari also speaking about disasters risk reduction in India. So her talk is titled Community Resilience for Disaster Risk Reduction by Engaging Local Governance in Bihar, India.
Welcome delegates. Namaste from India. I'm Dr. Geetanjali Kumari, working at COEDM, Center of Excellence in Disaster Management, DMI Patna, Bihar of India. I'm presenting this study, Community Resilience for Disaster Risk Reduction by Engaging Local Governance in Bihar, done by me along with my colleagues at COEDM, Vivek Kumar Singh and Amrita Diman. Bihar is one of the highly populous states of northern part of India, exposed to multi-hazards. Literacy rate and development index lag behind the national average, but culturally very sound and rich in the tacit knowledge of weather forecast and other natural disaster coping mechanism based on their traditional wisdom. The paper reviewed the pilot interventions of disaster risk reduction conducted in 3 districts of Bihar in the light of literature and guidelines on CBDRR. The Bihar DRR roadmap and departmental documents has also been appraised to understand the institutional arrangements of the concerned department and programmatic and contextual adaptations done by Government of Bihar. Detailed interactions with the key informants and nodal persons has been undertaken to analyze the pilot interventions like local stakeholders mapping, need assessment exercise, product designing methodology, field testing, networking, and the finalization. The pilot interventions led by Disaster Management Department along with the respective department and development partners. These interventions are aligned with the recommendations of Bihar Disaster Risk Reduction Roadmap. Long exposure to disaster necessitated the government of Bihar to develop the DRR roadmap in 2015. It is a 15 years plan based on Sendai framework. The present study is around the resilient village, which is one of the 5 conceptual pillars of the roadmap. These strategies further unpacked with the recommendations of CBDRR approach, innovative ways to engage local governance, capacity enhancement of stakeholders at the community. The Panchayat Raj Act or the local governance in the rural India came in existence in 2006. For the benefit of participants, I would like to explain that the Gram Panchayat is a cluster of one or a few small villages and the Panchayat members are elected representatives. Their arrangements and contribution in CBDRR are further facilitated by policy level adjustment and networking with the stakeholders. The leadership of local governance ensured proper blending of age-old local practices with the scientific approach of DRR in true perspective. And based on the need of the community, representatives from the Department of Disaster Management, Agriculture, Rural Development, Livelihood, Health, Social Welfare, have been nominated in addition to local governance. These interventions are intended to strengthen the local players in microplanning, networking, and DRR progress review of the village disaster management plan. The pilot interventions, the study has systematically captured the methodologies of the capacity need assessment of a much diversified group at community. The applied approach has successfully identified the role specific need of stakeholders as well as their preferred modalities. This approach helped in incorporation of local innovations and practical co-production knowledge based their capacity enhancement. In analysis, most of the recommended areas of capacity need captured are based on the nature of common disasters and challenges faced by them during earlier episodes. Interdepartmental partnership and convergence percolated efficiently right from the state level to the community in the program. Also, proper measures are included in the program design for sustainability and quality checks. At the same time, flexibility has also been provided to capture the indigenous practices with scientific line of intervention. The study has captured very encouraging and clear recommendations to adapt safe practices in rural communities of Bihar. The mixed methodology of the capacity enhancement found very effective. The design of interactive sessions with sufficient scope of socio-cultural and contextual adaptation is one of the key success. Participatory approach has created a sense of ownership and motivated the participants to take initiative, adopt safe practices within the accepted local ecosystem. PRI members are very influential person at the rural areas. Good attempts to encourage behavior changes among the task force members have been achieved by engaging and capacitating the local governance, that is PRI members. Institutionalizations and formal linkages with the resource persons and other government programs have been made, but it will take some time to bring these adjustments in practice. Application of adult learning principles and customized use of mass media, pictorial poster, etc. are also very well accepted among the target audience. Few limitations have also been captured in the study. The entire program has been envisaged on contact session and exercise based, but further rollout has been temporarily held up, slowed down due to onset of pandemic. Frequent updating of material and methodologies are also challenging, but need to develop in a new emerging complex scenario. Use of virtual platforms for capacity enhancement and software-based interactive system for monitoring and review will be helpful to move ahead during the current scenario. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kumari. So we heard one community-based risk reduction research from Philippines, and now we just heard a similar sort of approach from India. Next, we have John Ellick, who's going to be speaking about living with pervasive hazards, place-based scoping strategies of an island community in Cebu, Philippines.
Mabuhay everyone, I am John Sefri Elige from UP Los Baños. Today I am sharing my research which I did for my graduate degree program in geography in UP Diliman. Let's begin with the research question. Studies about risk have remained corporate in aspect and have focused on large-scale disasters. Taken out of the picture are hazards from the stresses and shocks of daily life. These risks include situations when people face the slow onset of pervasive hazards such as drought, coastal erosion, or those who live in flood-prone urban slums or in hazardous location. These hazards are widespread, diffuse in impact, gradual, but can be more accurately predicted. So they pose more challenges since they are dynamic and they can be experienced from place to place. Consequently, their social impacts are difficult to specify and may not be evident at first occurrence. Moreover, the focus of leading sources of disaster information, such as this one, only considers an event as a disaster if it followed such criteria. But these situations will indicate that people consciously chose to face a threat from natural hazards and discounts those threats and exposing themselves to more everyday risks related to poverty that leads to their further marginalization. These previous studies that you see exhibit how protracted daily neglect leads to fragile livelihoods for those who are already exposed to natural hazards. In order to understand the experiences of the people facing pervasive hazards, one view we can utilize is the idea of place. Here, place means the way of understanding the world by examining habits and actions based on the everyday lives. Since place and risks are socially constructed according to our authors from our experiences, this study, my research, then tried to describe the perceptions and coping strategies of people towards pervasive hazards in the island municipality of San Francisco, Cebu. Household survey and interviews with farmers were conducted with as well as with local officials to identify the perception and disaster risk management strategies across various sectors. San Francisco was chosen as the study site because they are the only municipality, or they are one of the municipalities who had already in place a structured disaster reduction strategy in the country. In fact, they were awarded by the United Nations sa Sakawa Award in 2011 and also got popular in the world news as they had zero casualty when Typhoon Haiyan hit the Philippines in 2013, which killed 6,300 people. They used an indigenous way of mobilizing people called Purok system. The Purok is a much smaller type of governance with only 200 families as a unit compared to mobilizing more than 2,000 people in a barangay. The study focused on the sites that captured the geographical setting of the island and represented the living conditions in the mountainous and coastal areas. For 2 months of research, the results indicate that recognizing the experiences and perceptions of the most vulnerable sector, the farmers and fisher folks in the island, can help us in understanding the local context of pervasive hazards. This table shows the summary of the comparison between extreme weather events and pervasive hazards. More diverse support is provided during times of extreme weather events. At the same time, the availability of crop insurance and others were identified as a support from the government. Respondents are also more greatly affected emotionally with pervasive hazards, while their coping strategies for extreme events and pervasive hazards are both embedded in the kind of social relationships they have in the community. That positive social bond they indicated as strategy, such as adopt a family and looking for alternative livelihood. Adopt a family is when the more or sturdier houses adopt a family living in or financially challenged families in times of extreme weather events such as typhoon. They were used as evacuation sites. These are all rooted from the combination of the innate social value of mutual help or pintakasi in Cebuano or bayanihan in Tagalog. One particular government intervention, however, that received varying perceptions among interviewees is cash transfer. While the local officials think that it has some success, most respondents and interviewees believe that it makes them dependent. It makes the people dependent on external support when, in fact, a proper social preparation should be prioritized. Moreover, this figure illustrates the events and experiences of the people in 12-month cycle. As you can see, the farmers and fisher folks, they are differently affected by pervasive hazards. Also, the experiences of the fisher folks vary depending on their orientation to the sea, because the monsoon winds affect the height of the sea waves. The most crucial period for them, or hardship period, starts from June, and recovery begins towards the end of November. With this, the role of the farmer and fisher folk doubles to provide food and income to the family. And there are several theoretical and practical implications from the result of this study. First is perception is affected by frequency and intensity of the hazard. Though post-disaster situations take most of the news and data reports, this screens out the daily struggles and might create more risks in the future. Hence, integrating the everyday practice of people with risk assessment and disaster management is necessary. Second, vulnerability is exacerbated by pervasive hazards, and the impacts may vary across space, scale, and season. The hardships from pervasive hazards differ across socioeconomic groups as well, even if they are in the same environment, particularly for those who can migrate and work outside the island. Lastly, social interactions influence coping strategies. The residents of San Francisco cope up with difficulties by looking for alternative livelihood through their relatives and extended family networks more than the government and other organizations. Indeed, the power of anticipation is helpful or useful in confronting pervasive hazards. The government can bridge the gaps between the sector's needs and state interventions by prioritizing projects and programs, while the local people can harness their own strengths by creating their vision, goals, and objectives while also promoting long-term disaster preparedness. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you, John, for a engaging and informative presentation. We now move on to Muhammad Malwani, who's going to be talking about surviving the colossal eruption of Samalas 1257 CE, Lombok, Indonesia, lessons from the ancient civilization's response to disaster.
Hello, good morning everyone. In this session, I will present my research entitled Surviving the Colossal Eruption of Samalas in 13th Century, Lombok, Indonesia. Lesson from the ancient civilization response to disaster. This research is supported by the Directorate General of Resource for Science, Technology and Higher Education, Indonesia, and partly supported by the research grant of PDUPT and AMI research grant of Palian. Eruption that record in the white dinosaurs, such as Vesuvius, Elja, Etna, Tambora, and Krakatau, and so many others. But this now not much, but several is better for how to connect between the volcanology and the historic source. But did you know that some issues remain unresearched or remain rarely discussed in the connection between volcanology and history? This is about how ancient population carry the emergency response or recovery during the crisis period, during the moment of the eruption or after the eruption, because several historical sources just provide the information about the timing eruption, about the impact on the eruption and so on, but the response of the ancient population is rarely discussed or rarely described in the source. And then we found that Puppet Lombok in Indonesia is described about the Samalas eruption previously used by Frank Laffing for describing the or proving or finding the Samalas eruption in the 13th century in Indonesia. And then we deeply analyzed about the source, and then we found that this source is contains several information that previously never been recognized about the description about the eruption. So our objective is to analyze the several verses in the source in Babat Lombok combined with graphical approach to identify the evacuation process, migration process, and also how the civilization respond the disaster of Samalas eruption. And then we searching several verses, and then we found and we categorize the first categories of the source is the nature of the eruption. Actually, this verse of the 273 and 274 is already used by previously research by Mutakin et al. And Mutakin and Lapin to describe the effect of the Samalas. This verse, the previous verse, is also support the illustration of the finding from the Samalas and Vidal about the pyroclastic fall and also pyroclastic source that they are flowing until the sea. And then the next category about the societal response. This is about the migration of the displaced people of the moment. In this category of in the system of the response of the impact of the eruption, described actually in 5 verse, the previous one, and also adding by the 4 other, that telling about how the people escape from the disaster, where they escape and how they escape. We can see here several toponymy, several localities name are mentioned for the displaced people or the people of the victims searching the safe place for they take refuge, they take shelter from the disaster eruption of the Samalas, such as in Samulia, Boro, Bandar, Pakumba. We use the geographical approach, searching the toponymic name on the Lombok based on on the present topographic map, and then we mapping all of the name of the toponymy, all of the name locality that mentioned in the paper. But however, some localities cannot be tracing in the present toponymy because maybe change the name or the interpreter is wrong to the description of the name, etc., etc. But it should be noted that the displaced people have encouraged the evacuation with their respective leaders. So every group of the displaced people is leading by someone respectively from the kingdom, ancient kingdom of Amata. Okay, the green area, the green dot is where the new civilization is built after they take refugee. We can see here that the king lived in the Lombok, royal noble lived in the Karangmumbul, etc., etc. So several locations are led by the royal or family or the important people of the Pamatan kingdom. So the first one, they migrate in the new location, and then they make a new government, and then they conduct the physical building of the city. So this is the mode of the response of the eruption. First is they displace exodus. Maybe we can take use this mode and this word, and then they make a new governance, new government, and a new leader, etc. And then they build the new physical building. You can see here the first describe that a palace was constructed, a square big road, and then the big city already solid. And also the city of Rangbatun is already constructed, complete with the fort. So they rebuild the city after they displace and after they make a new government. And then this is the discussion and conclusion. 5 verses in the manuscript describe the inhabitant response to the eruption. And then 2 verses indicate that the coping strategy, and 5 others describe the new beginning of the civilization in Lombok. Geographical approach and toponymic mapping are useful to depicting the village, displaced people, and new civilization in Lombok after the eruption or in the 13th century. And then we know that the survival strategy of the ancient civilization in the midst of natural disaster in Lombok is applying the paradigm of the response-centric. So they just respond, avoiding the hazard, and then seeking the safe place. But we know that this paradigm is applied until in the 60s maybe. So this is a long-term paradigm that applying in Indonesia. The result also emphasizes that Indonesia has had a social capital for coping with the disaster since the 13th century, or maybe they have experience in that. So this is long last social capital that exists before the 13th century. And the last is Babat Lombok. We conclude that maybe the Babat Lombok is the oldest manuscript that containing a complete description of the societal response and coping strategy to volcanic eruption in the Southeast Asia.
Thank you, Mohammed, for a fascinating look at a historical sort of perspective on disaster and disaster management. We now move on to our final speaker for this session, Sophia Carlade, who's going to be talking about evaluating municipal disaster risk reduction and management plan towards improving disaster management, a case study in the Philippines.
Good day, everyone. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to present our paper at the Second International Symposium on Disaster Resilience and Sustainable Development. I am Sofia Caralde, and on behalf of my co-authors, I will be presenting our paper entitled Evaluating the Municipal Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Plan Towards Improving Disaster Management, a case study in the Philippines. The Philippines enacted the Philippine Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Plan Act of 2010 to mitigate the risk of natural disasters and prepare our community. The law envisions to have a safer, adaptive, and disaster-resilient Filipino communities towards sustainable development, which can be achieved through the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Plan, which will then be translated into a local disaster risk reduction and management plan. This plan aims to shift the reactive disaster management of the country into a proactive disaster management. The plans should focus on the four thematic areas of disaster management, namely disaster prevention and mitigation, disaster preparedness, disaster response, and disaster rehabilitation and recovery. The law also provides for resource mobilization, such that 5% of the internal revenue allotment of the local government units should be spent primarily on disaster preparedness and DRR activities, while 30% of the said revenue should be allotted for quick response funding. The locale of the study is the municipality of Nuevo Laguna. In a recent study of Patty et al., it is discovered that Mabitac Laguna is socially vulnerable to flooding. However, it did not hinder Mabitac Laguna from creating its own municipal disaster risk reduction and management plan and effectively implementing the same, garnering recognition from different organizations in the Philippines as an effective disaster management municipality. The objectives of the study is to characterize the implementation of the plan of Mabitac Laguna based on the four thematic areas of disaster management, and evaluate the implementation of the plan based on its effectiveness, efficiency, and relevance. Lastly, to identify recommendations to the MDRRMP of the Mabitac. Data gathered were from survey interviews from the community members, as well as key informant interviews with the Municipal Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Office, together with select barangay officials. Results show that the improved disaster management of Mabitac Laguna is observed from its disaster prevention and mitigation to its activities on disaster rehabilitation and recovery. And as such, Mabitac Laguna offers several best practices that can be adopted to improve a community's disaster management and achieve a resilient community. So for the four thematic areas of disaster management, there are best practices identified in Mabitak Laguna. For example, in disaster prevention and mitigation, notable here on how Mabitak Laguna addressed its social vulnerability to flooding by ensuring that the rivers were clean, there are river walls to limit the overflow of the river and minimize the impact to the community such that they relocated the families located near the river banks or in the hazard prone areas to a safer area. And then they also installed early warning system to monitor the flood water rise during heavy downpour. And it's also noticed that they have increased their budget allocation for local disaster risk reduction and management fund, showing the slow shift to a more proactive disaster management. As to disaster preparedness, it is noticed how the municipality of Mabitak tried different avenues to capacitate their community. So they have directly capacitating the Sangguniang Barangay and different people's organization. They also try to capacitate their children and youth and directly conducting household visits to give them information materials. As to disaster response, they have decentralized rescue group. So each barangay, the 15 barangays of Mabitak Laguna, has their own disaster response team. And then they also have pre-packed relief goods with the basic food and non-food needs of the community. And for disaster recovery and rehabilitation, Mabitak Laguna has ensured that they have offered sustainable livelihood opportunities to their community members and provided financial support to vulnerable sectors after the disasters, especially to farmers and fisher folks. As to the effectiveness, efficiency, and relevance of the Municipal Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Plan, the following criteria were used. So results showed that the plan of Mabitak is effective because it effectively included different sectors, stakeholders of the community in its planning process and was effective in distributing and increasing the knowledge of the community as to disaster management and disaster preparedness. Mabitak Laguna is also efficient in its use of its limited resources, such that they were able to still procure enough rescue equipment for the municipality and its barangays and distribute enough information campaigns, paraphernalia to its community members. Lastly, it is relevant because it directly contributes to the goal of RA 101.1 to create a safer, adaptive, and disaster resilient community, and the community members understand the value of such goal. However, there are still gaps identified in the implementation of the plan. Some are here listed in the table, and I would like to focus on the lack of financial documentation, which in comparison to the plan activities and the prospective funding, it was different from what was actually implemented and funded. So we recommend that the municipality of Mabitak Laguna develop their own logical framework together with its community so that they also create a sense of ownership for the community. A logical framework would help them plot out the activities and the funding needed, and it would be easier for them to track the development and the implementation of the plans without them getting out of track in its implementation. So that's it for my presentation. I hope you learned a thing or two from our presentation. And if you have any questions and clarifications, feel free to email the corresponding author at that you may provide me. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia, and thanks to all of our presenters who did a great job with their time and recorded good videos within the time limit. So we now have a nice window of 10 to 15 minutes for a live Q&A session. I note that there have been some great questions and discussion going on in the chat box, but let's maybe open it up for people to ask questions live now in the session. So as Michael already pointed out, please use the raise hand function so that we can call on you, as well as share who the question is directed towards. And for the most part, we'd like you to ask a question which is not already asked and answered in the chat box, so that everybody has a chance to sort of jump in and there's more of a discussion. All right. So please go ahead if anybody has a question, comments, observation. All right, so we have quite a silent room going here. So maybe I will kick off with a question. So I think this is a question for Dr. Shubham and his co-author, who were discussing the oil spills and the plan, sort of looking at the management plan within Thailand. Sort of as a more comparative observation, I was wondering if you had observations on sort of globally, is there a standard, or are there some countries which have a sort of better management plan or sort of benchmark on how this should be done, and where does sort of Thailand fit within that kind of comparative approach? I believe Dr. Shubham is here. I did see him earlier. He might have left. All right, so that went into an empty room. Michael, would you want to jump in with a question for our participants?
Yeah, thank you. I just want to say thanks again to all the speakers as well. I think we certainly learned a lot from a lot of different perspectives, not just different countries, but different disciplines, legal, social, physical sciences. Really great to hear. Maybe a general question for any of the presenters that wants to respond. I think we heard a lot in the session about impacts and about risks and vulnerability as well. In your country or in your case study area, if you could be in front of the main decision maker or the main decision makers, what one recommendation would you have for them based on the findings of your research?
Can I?
Dr. Kayamanda.
Okay.
Please.
Yes. Actually, in my research, one of the interesting results of the study is that you have defined, in the Philippines, we have a defined disaster risk and reduction management plan or policies. But sadly, when you go to the community levels, it is not clearly translated at the levels of the community. So if I will be asked to recommend what would be the best action in terms of making the communities or capacitate the communities in terms of response to disasters like flooding, in my study, it's very clear that they lack the inputs from the levels of the communities, because technically the study that I did revealed that there are already adaptive mechanisms that are in place in the communities because they have been exposed or experiencing flooding for the past, I think, 20 years or more. So this is not being documented. This is not documented, so therefore it is not being adopted by the policymakers. So there is a level of, I think, inconsistencies in terms of what is the plan and how do you implement it, because at the level of the community, sometimes the plan does not fit the context of the communities. So I think that's one. That's why I really worked on, or I lobby for, community-based. Let's look at the practices and the experiences of the communities, because they know better how to deal with the problem that the government or the policymakers sometimes cannot appreciate because they are only at the planning stage. So sometimes that's the difficulty in the Philippine setting, because the planning does not adhere to the level or the context of the communities or the ground level. So that's one, I think, that I would lobby for based on my study. And I think even the presentation of the other presenters who are Philippine context, we share the same, I think, the same observation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions from the floor? Anybody want to ask? You can use the chat or put your hand up. Or if any of the other speakers.
Sure, I'll go with a follow-up question, because one of sort of the pattern I was noticing across the various presentations was that we had some of our presenters talking about sort of more national level plans or more national level issues or sort of an approach in their study. But we also had, across both from Philippines and India, similarly, some very community-based kind of local interventions or local approaches or sort of leading this. And so the question, I guess, for me, and this is sort of more speculative or food for thought for all of us, is sort of where do we go between this kind of very decentralized approach to versus a more kind of centralized national kind of approach or national plan, because we see some of these disaster scenarios or hazards maybe at a national level, and it may impact many different states or many different regions, but we're also seeing sort of solutions which are coming up based in communities or specific states. So I could also see, for instance, in India, we had some examples from very specific states, what they were doing. So where does the sort of learning, cross-learning take place, even within a country? And of course, we're talking now across international sort of context. So just for all of us to sort of think about how do we link the local and the regional and the national, and of course now the global, because we're now in a global kind of forum. So again, any thoughts from anybody or just kind of observations or ideas? Yes, Shweta, you're muted. Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'd just like to add a few points based on India, because talking about the three major issues, the heat waves and also the rise in temperature, and I've been talking about some of the nature-based solutions. But the challenge we find at the local level is these kind of nature-based solutions have not been studied, or the effectiveness has not been done properly. Probably there are certain cases where the cost benefit analysis is being done for these nature-based solutions. But as far as, we talk about so many adaptation and mitigation measures at the ground level. And when we look at the effectiveness of its implementation or the adaptability or replicating it or scaling it at different scales, it becomes a challenge. So, things are there, they're existing, but they're at a, at a very superficial level. And definitely, if we talk about different kinds of hazards, we see more nature-based solutions in terms of water and water resources related issues and agricultural adaptation, but very little has been done in terms of mangroves and wetlands, which also, I think we've discussed on a very broad level in terms of this rising issue of sea level rise in India, also in the eastern as well as the Delta region, the west of Bengal, and the other issues. So it's really interesting actually to look at, when you actually try to look at the cost benefit analysis of these nature-based solutions, you don't find much examples. So I think this is a very interesting area where we could do more research and get involved at different kind of projects at ground level to see how these could benefit to the communities at the local level. That's all. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Others with questions or any observations? I think we have a couple of minutes more, maybe a last few before we have to wrap up the session.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something on looking at that national scale, because we were focusing on the Philippines and vulnerability on a national scale, but a lot of the case studies that we found were on a more local level. So it was really interesting comparing the different trends between the local and then comparing that to the national and kind of getting an understanding of the perspective of vulnerability. And we found very clear sort of patterns. So I think trying to understand that and sort of contextualize what that means is a big challenge. But yeah, it's something that's quite interesting that we found in our research.
Thank you, Jasmine.
Okay, just to add in Davao City recently, I had a way of following up the study that I conducted. So I am in close contact with the Disaster Risk and Reduction Management Office. And recently they were able to adopt one of my suggestions to contextualize the IEC materials. So instead of just adopting what the national level is being prepared, instead of just disseminating this to the communities, right now they are doing the pamphlets, the billboards, the radio commercials in the dialect. So I think that's one way of addressing the contextualization issue, because some of the communities that I have been into, they really cannot understand some of the technical terms that are placed in the materials. So even though there are a lot of materials, one of the results of my study is that they cannot appreciate the information therein because some of the information are highly technical. So this is one way of addressing the localized approach. They are still following the national plan, but it is translated in a manner which is more acceptable and appreciated by the communities.
Thank you so much for that insight. I think we're now at time. So thank you all for a very lively session. Michael, if you want to add some final words before we bid everyone a good evening and a good night.
Yeah, thank you, Joy. Just to say thanks as well. And obviously we can't all now go and have a conversation in the restaurant or in the coffee room, but there is a networking channel on the conference Padlet page. So hope everyone stays in touch there and continues the good work. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, now before we conclude this session, a few reminders. Thank you very much to Dr. Chatterjee and Mr. Boylan, as well as to all the presenters and the audience. It was a very informative session and a fruitful discussion. And can I just say that the chat was very active, more active than our live conversation. So I thank you all. A few reminders before we close this session. There will be a special session tomorrow at 9 Bangkok time about the Bangkok Metropolitan Region Resiliency and Sustainability. It will be followed by the keynote session 3 at 12 noon Bangkok time. Afterwards, the rest of the technical sessions will commence in their respective halls. And then for now, the session hall will have a break for today, but participants are encouraged still to use the networking lounge as Mr. Boylan has suggested. You can drop your emails there and also give your insights on different topics. Again, thank you very much. And this was a very smooth and interactive session. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.